Otis Noble III, LA Social Science, an e-form that's really looking to bridge the gap between the Division of Social Sciences, and Los Angeles proper. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Professor Felipe Goncalves. Professor Goncalves is an assistant professor of economics. You got your BA at Columbia, your PhD at Princeton, and before coming to UCLA, were you at the New York Crime Lab? Is that correct?
Correct, yes. So I was at the New York Crime Lab. It's an organization run out of the University of Chicago, but I was sitting at their New York office.
So
Yeah.
your research, I want to go there because your research is really timely with what we're seeing as it relates to unrest around the country and around the world. So tell us a little bit more about your research, if you could.
Sure. So I would say that broadly speaking, I'm an applied microeconomist, and what that means is that my research focuses on using data to empirically answer questions related to microeconomics, and in particular, I focus on questions of policing and crime. And a big part of that is understanding police behavior, and in particular, how can we identify police misbehavior, and what policies might be useful for mitigating police misbehavior, police misconduct. And so one particular paper that I've been working on for the past several years is on identifying discrimination in traffic enforcement. This is a paper that is joint with Steve Mello, who is an assistant professor of economics at Dartmouth. And so in this paper, we try to figure out how do we identify discrimination of police officers, of traffic officers, but more so, how do we identify discrimination of individual police officers? And so the setting we're looking at is traffic enforcement in Florida, where, like a lot of states, the fine schedule for speeding has jumps at certain speeds. So what happens in Florida is if you're going 6 to 9 miles per hour over the limit, it's around $125 fine for speeding. If you go 10 miles per hour over the limit, that jumps by about $75. It goes to around $200 fine. And then it's flat from 10 to 15. And so what officers will regularly do for drivers when they get stopped is they'll say, okay, you were going, let's say, 13 miles per hour over the limit. I'm going to give you a break, and I'm going to write down in your ticket that you are actually going 9 miles per hour over the limit. And so this is a form of lenience that officers practice. This is something that has actually happened to me. I was talking to Steve about it, and we said, well, let's see if this is actually something you can see in the data, and is it something that might be happening more for, let's say, white drivers than Black and Hispanic drivers. And so what happens is that because officers are doing this behavior, you actually see a big spike in the distribution of tickets right at 9 miles per hour over the limit. And there's what looks like a missing mass from 10 to 15 miles per hour over. However, when you look at this spike at 9 miles per hour over, it's bigger for white drivers than Black and Hispanic drivers. So that's kind of our first order evidence that it seems like white drivers are getting more of a break than minority drivers, than Black and Hispanic drivers. And then what's nice about this setting that's unique in a lot of criminal justice settings is that officers are engaging in a pretty consistent behavior. They write a lot of speeding tickets every day. And so you can actually measure this disparity in treatment for each police officer. So there are a lot of studies on racial bias in policing, racial bias in the criminal justice system. Those studies tend to be able to say, well, can we argue that there's any racial bias among judges that we're looking at, among the set of officers we're looking at? But it's very hard to say, well, if we see some bias, who's contributing to it? How much of the population is contributing to it? Here we can actually say, well, this officer is treating drivers differently by race. This officer is not. And so we're able to disaggregate to each individual officer. And what we find is that about 40% of officers treat drivers differently by race. So they're more likely to give a discount to white drivers than minority drivers.
So you mentioned that 40% of officers in your setting you look at and are practicing discrimination. Does that degree of discrimination vary with the race or gender of the officer?
Yes, it does. So, white officers relative to minority officers are more discriminatory on average, meaning they're more likely to give breaks to white drivers than minority drivers. That being said, minority officers are also on average discriminatory in favor of white drivers. And so it's kind of interesting because perhaps you're just thinking about it abstractly, you might think their discrimination is zero, or something near zero. It actually seems like that group also has some degree of discrimination. It's just less severe than for or as less pronounced than for white officers. And the story is similar for male and female officers, that male officers on average are slightly more discriminatory. And one interesting thing that I would also say about this study, that I think that finding is illuminating for other studies, is that in many cases the best approach you can take to answer these kinds of questions is, let's compare the white officers to the minority officers. So let's say, how much more likely are white officers to disproportionately ticket minority drivers relative to white drivers, and let's compare that to the minority officers. And what we find here is that you'll still find some discrimination if you do that, but you actually miss a lot, because even the minority officers to some extent are also treating white and minority drivers differently.
Which kind of leads to the next question I had for you, because I got a chance to dig into the research a little bit. Just amazing work, by the way. But do you have a sense of whether the disparities in treatment are conscious or implicit on the parts of the officer?
Yeah, so if you look at the average officer will give discounts to drivers 30 to 35% of the time. And the average gap between white and minority officers, white and minority drivers is about 3 percentage points. So in terms of magnitudes for the average officer, that's somewhat small. The way we like to think about it, though, is that's comparable to the black-white wage gap. So it's not insignificant by any means. But perhaps for the average officer, that seems like a magnitude that is consistent with implicit or subconscious bias, in the sense that they are still giving discounts to minority drivers. It's just that when you aggregate up across their hundreds of tickets, they're giving them less often for minority drivers than white drivers. That being said, there's a huge spread across officers. So officers at the 90th percentile of discrimination are giving breaks twice as often to white drivers than black and Hispanic drivers. And of course, it's a judgment call to say whether or not that's subconscious or conscious. But I think when you get disparities that are that striking, I think it's much harder to say that this is a subconscious behavior.
Yeah, no, thank you for pointing that out. I mean, I appreciate that we, make that distinguishing, point about implicit or, conscious. But, in this conversation, I'm glad that you and your research partner are really kind of digging into that a little bit to really kind of illuminate that point for us. So what policies seem more effective at addressing the disparities that you are identifying? And more general, are there any overarching insight we can draw about discrimination in policing?
Yeah, so one of the strengths of the setting here is that because we're able to identify discrimination for each individual officer, we are able to say, okay, what kind of personnel policies might impact the degree of discrimination? And what I mean by that is, things like what happens if we hire more minority officers? What happens if we hire more female officers? What we find here is that some of these traditional personnel policies, like the ones I just suggested, changing the racial and gender composition of the department, the first order effect is that discrimination will go down by a little bit, but it won't go down by that much on aggregate. The disparities in treatment don't go down by that much. And part of that is what I said before, that officer race is correlated with the degree of discrimination, but it's not an extremely strong relationship. Another policy that we considered is saying, well, let's try to get rid of the 5% or 10% most discriminatory officers, replace them with an average officer. What's going to happen to the disparity in treatment? And again, we don't find that much of an effect of doing that. And part of that comes from the fact that, like I said, 40% of officers have at least some degree of discrimination. So that 5% most discriminatory, yes, they have a severe amount of discrimination. They treat white and minority drivers very differently, but making them an average officer is not going to really move the needle on the overall amount of discrimination. And then a final policy that we consider, or set of policies, is questions about how do you shift officers around, how do you reassign officers across locations. And so one thought we considered was, let's take the most discriminatory officers based on our measure, and let's move those officers to neighborhoods with very few Black and Hispanic drivers. The setting we're looking at is the Florida Highway Patrol. So we're looking at as different counties. So let's take an officer, they're in a specific troop, a specific region in Florida. Instead of policing in one county, let's put them in a nearby county that has a lower share of minority drivers. And we actually find that doesn't have too much of an effect either. And I think the reasoning there is actually very insightful for one of the key issues that you have to think about here, which is that the discriminatory officers do treat white and minority drivers differently, but they are more lenient than the average officer on average. So that's something I haven't really mentioned here yet, which is that officers differ in how much they discriminate, how much they differentially treat white and minority drivers, but they also differ in just the level of how lenient they are to drivers. There are some officers who treat everybody completely by the book, and they say, I don't give any breaks. In our definition, they're not discriminatory, but they're also not being lenient towards anybody. And so what happens is if you take the discriminatory officer, take him out of the minority county, okay, they're not exposed to a discriminatory officer, but the officer that comes in to replace that person might actually just be less lenient towards everybody. And so what's going to happen on average? They're not exposed to discriminatory officers, but they might just be exposed to officers who are not nice to anybody. And so we find that policy actually doesn't work particularly well. What we do find that does seem to work, at least for these very simple calculations we're doing, is that take the officers who are most lenient, separate from how they differentially treat white and minority drivers, just on an aggregate level, how lenient are they, and put those officers in the minority-heavy counties. And that does a lot to mitigate the aggregate disparity. That pretty much levels off the average difference in outcomes between white and minority drivers. To me, this is a very interesting insight because most of the focus on the economics literature, not as much in the public discussion, but perhaps for good reason, a lot of the focus in the economics literature is how do we identify individual discrimination? So an officer is within a neighborhood, he faces two people who commit the same offense, or they have a similar level of apparent suspicion. Are they more likely to enforce the law against a minority person versus a white person? That is very different from saying that policing is heavier or equal between white and minority populations, white and minority neighborhoods. And so to be able to answer that second question, you need to go beyond just individual levels of discrimination and say, well, what is the exposure of minority populations versus white populations to the severity of enforcement? And so that's kind of one of the insights we have in this paper is you could take every officer and make them completely race blind, and a lot of the disparity will not go away. And the reason is because the harsher officers on average tend to be in the more minority heavy counties. And so I think it should give us some pause in focusing just on officer level discrimination at the individual level. It's definitely important. It's most of the focus of our study, but it's not going to be 100% of the solution to these problems, because from a more aggregate level, the degree of enforcement does vary to a significant extent across neighborhoods. And that isn't just because officers are treating individuals differently. It has to do with who's being sent where, how many officers are being sent to each neighborhood. So that would be, to me, a big overarching insight when it comes to policy from this study.
Yeah, I really, like I said, I really enjoyed, digging into the research. It furthered my understanding of how hegemonic, these spaces can be, as it relates to officers. But, just really encourage folks to go out and look at the research you and your research partner put forth. Like I said, just really makes you think about what you're encountering as it relates to, some of these just interactions. But are there any other studies that you're pursuing in the area? Just, looking at anything else that you may be putting forth?
Yes. So, like I said, my research very broadly focuses on policing and crime. This is one study in a set of studies that I'm working on police behavior, looking at what policies might impact police outcomes. So I have one study that should be coming out in the near future looking at police unions and police collective bargaining. So there's been a lot of discussion, especially in the last few weeks, about what role do police unions play in shielding problem officers. What role do they play in institutionalizing certain protections for officers? But there's not very much empirical evidence. So what happens when a department unionizes? What happens to the number of fatal incidents in the city? And what happens to other measures of police misconduct? So I'm working on a study looking at that's collected a lot of different sources on police unionization, a lot of different measures of police misconduct and fatal incidents. So I'm excited to share the results of that probably later in the summer. And I'm also working on another study with several co-authors looking at the role of civilian complaints in potentially mitigating police misbehavior. So this is one of the policies that people have also been looking at, is the fact that police officers on average get quite a few complaints, especially if you look at these particular officers that have had these high-profile incidents. If we look at the officer that killed George Floyd, that officer had something like 19 civilian complaints, and so there's a big question of, on average, is this generally true that the officers that are getting lots of complaints, are they also bad in other dimensions? Is this an effective tool for identifying problem officers? And then beyond that, are civilian complaints, if we actually follow through with them, if we discipline officers, say for low-level complaints, is that actually useful for deterring them from other misbehavior? And so this is another study we're looking at, in particular, comparing officers who have a complaint where the department sustains it, you get disciplined, versus officers that get a complaint and the department doesn't do anything with it, the complaint isn't sustained or you don't get disciplined. What happens to those officers' behavior afterwards? It's obviously an extremely policy relevant question right now. How do we address these very clear issues with policing? I think people are very interested in figuring out what policies work. And there's a lot of research out there on these questions, but I think some of the research right now has actually is more mixed than you'd think for some big policy proposals. So I think people are very much interested in finding out what are new policy tools available for figuring out how we can address these issues of police misconduct, police use of force, and other more generally disparities in policing between white and minority communities.
Thank you so much for the research you're doing. I know, it's not just going to help communities of color, it's going to help all communities. And it's also going to help those folks who are working within those departments. This is very timely. This is very necessary to really kind of have, just amazing folks like yourself as a partner as we try to work to change, how policing happens in our country. So thank you for the research you're doing. Look forward to, really kind of hearing your name more so as, you really kind of climb that accelerated ladder here at UCLA. And look forward to bringing you back on and having the conversation about some of the new research you're putting forth.
Okay, great. I would love that. And thank you so much, Otis. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I very much enjoyed this conversation.
No. It's all you. Thanks again for the work you're doing. Take care.
All right. Thanks so much.